All right, guys. So it's actually Wednesday, and I know you all got my email. So we're finishing up this unit, and then you'll have your exam on Friday. So you're watching this probably late on Wednesday. Maybe you'll watch it on Thursday. I don't know, but whenever you're watching this, just obviously make sure that you are prepared to log in for the exam at 2 p.m. on Friday. You'll have that scheduled hour from 2 to 3 on Friday in Populi, just like the first exam. So same basic format, no surprise there. So just make sure you do that. It's all in there and set to go. But we have one more topic, or a couple of topics actually, to address today. So I'm going to walk you through those. And then hopefully, crossing our fingers, hoping that we're back together in person on Monday, but we'll see, guys. I'm responding to all these emails just like you guys are. Oh, by the way, so I've got I don't know if you can, I've got my Bruce tartan bow tie on here today, even though I'm sitting here talking to you from home. So I thought that was kind of fun. Got my flu shot this morning. So if I pass out or faint, it's not because of a heart attack or anything. It's probably because I got a bad vaccine. I'm just teasing. We'll be fine. There we go. Gotta get a little caffeine in me. Okay, so we're gonna start by talking a little bit about transcendentalism. Except that this is a little frozen right now, so let me see if it's gonna move for me. Hold on a second. Let me pause this. Okay, may have had just a slight glitch there. Sorry, I had to make sure that we get this thing. There we go. I'm going to come back to Brook Farm in a second, but we're going to talk a little bit about the Transcendentalists. And there are two of them that I'll mention, and we'll focus on one of the two. His name's Henry David Thoreau. So Transcendentalism is a really interesting philosophical movement in the mid-19th century in the United States. And really what it is, it builds on some of the ideas put forth by what were called Romantic philosophers in Europe in the earlier part of the 19th century. So back around 1810, 1820, that neck of the woods. And Romantics, I know that word makes it sound like it has something to do with sentimentality and romance in a more modernized traditional sense, but it's not about that. A Romantic philosophy in Europe was much more about distancing oneself from the idea that the only things worth knowing were empirical. So really the Romantic thinkers in Europe in the early 19th century were kind of reacting to the Enlightenment thinkers, right? So the Enlightenment was based pretty thoroughly on the notions of logic and reason and things that you could see and touch and hear and things that you could test through experimentation and all the rest. So the empiricism that goes along with the Enlightenment is critical with that philosophy. Well, the Romantics were responding to that and saying, look, there are equally important things, maybe even more important things than that which can be measured empirically. And so they felt that the realm of the senses and emotion, that these were equally important, perhaps even more important. So that's the Romantic philosophers. The Transcendentalists in the United States are borrowing heavily from the Romantic philosophers of Europe. So Transcendentalists like this guy here, you have a slide here of Ralph Waldo Emerson, sometimes referred to as the father of Transcendentalism. And I won't dig into all that. He's definitely one of the pioneers of the philosophical movement. Emerson had an understudy of sorts that is going to be our focus, and his name was Henry David Thoreau. And Thoreau, in many respects, kind of, in the end, I think his legacy is more often referenced now than his mentor Emerson, which is probably unfair a little bit, but Thoreau is just such an eccentric guy, and he wrote some very interesting things, and I think a lot of people kind of took to him in that sense, and so his fame has stood the test of time, probably a little bit better than Emerson in some ways. They're both pretty important, though. I don't want to undersell Emerson, but Emerson and Thoreau are approaching this. The notion of transcendentalism is that an individual can essentially transcend or go beyond the world of the senses. And it is, as I just mentioned with the Romantics, it is definitely a direct challenge to the rational thought of the Enlightenment. And so what it's really doing is it's advocating each individual's discovery of his or her original relationship with nature. And I'll get back to some of the interesting applications that Thoreau himself had with that. But it's more than just connection with the physical structure of nature. So, connection with the natural environment. That's part of it, but it's more than that. The transcendentalists talk in a very pantheistic way about the connection to something they reference as the oversoul. This mystical essence, ostensibly, from which we all come, that we're all connected to. It's very similar to, to the Star Wars reference to the Force. It is thoroughly pantheistic in nature. So if we talk about Asian pantheism, like Buddhism, for instance, there is the reference to the universal one, this mystical force field of a kind from which that we're supposedly all connected to, and that really the most important parts of our existence are experienced through the soul. They're experienced through, these more ethereal qualities than physical ones. So it's definitely there's this, with transcendentalism, there's this mystical connection to something very, very similar to what George Lucas is telling us through his Star Wars films. So when you hear Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi talk about the Force as this mystical field that we all reunite with when we die, and that really the important thing for individuals to do is to seek separation from relationships and attachments and things. So the transcendentalists didn't make that particular component really as much of their focus. They were a little bit more comfortable with human relationships than Asian pantheists would have been. But there are generally some pantheistic connections to be made. So Thoreau, I just want you to know a little bit about this guy. You see his lifespan here, 1817 to 1862. So Thoreau is, I'm not sure if I have a, Brook Farm. Okay, yeah, we're talking about communities this particular hour. I'm not going to spend time on Brook Farm. I'm going to deal with the communities. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Shakers and the Oneida community. Brook farmers are experimenting with really transcendentalism. It's kind of this communal setting where you see its location outside Boston, and so a lot of Bostonians, Emerson, Thoreau, are living in and around Boston. So these transcendentalists would travel out to Brook Farm and experience some time together and talk about all the higher things that they were interested in. The idea with this is located in, I believe, Roxbury, Massachusetts. Doesn't actually come up on our map, if I recall correctly. Roxbury, I don't think is there. Oh, there it is. Yeah, it is. So Brook Farm is listed right there. So, so Brook Farm is located a little southwest of Boston, and the idea was that this community would be largely self-sufficient, and that it would be kind of separated from the other realities and traditions in American society, that they would think and live differently, and they wouldn't be polluted by all the the social upheaval and the politics of their day and all that kind of stuff. And that this would just be a haven for transcendentalist thinkers in particular. Many of them were migrating out to Brook Farm for a time. Thoreau's contributions are really interesting, though, in a couple of different ways. Thoreau was, he got a little bit tired of Emerson's pretty general approach, which was more abstract and more theoretical. So Emerson obviously wrote short stories and poetry and also philosophy, and Emerson seemed to enjoy the thinking process quite a bit more than Thoreau was prepared to dwell on. It's not that Thoreau didn't think the thought was important. He did realize that the philosophical abstractions certainly had to be understood. But Thoreau wanted action. And so his writings he viewed his writings as important, but his writings were typically, these tracts. I would compare him in this way to somebody like Thomas Paine from back in the American Revolution, where Paine was trying to propel people to take action with these caustic but inspirational words and speeches and whatnot. So when you read through Paine's Common Sense, he's talking about all the problems with George III and why the colonials needed to rebel and why they needed to throw off oppression. Well, there's a similar approach with Thoreau. So, one of his famous pieces is called Civil Disobedience. And so Thoreau, Thoreau's trying to use this transcendentalist orientation to kind of get people to start living more consistently with their philosophical claims. And so Thoreau and Emerson were both, by the way, abolitionists. They were part of the abolitionist movement that springs up in the 1840s and 50s in particular. And so they would write a lot of tracts, challenging people to think about the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, about all men being created equal, and in a very real sense try to point out the inherent problems and hypocrisies in American society relating to matters of that kind. So they deserve some real credit for that. With Civil Disobedience, Thoreau begins to, he kind of lays out an explanation for why he believes certain policies, certain laws in both the federal government, but also Massachusetts state law, that he finds to be incompatible with the American spirit. And so he starts to suggest, we have a right to speak our minds and to try to engage in dialogue that changes, that brings people to change whatever laws we think are unjust or what have you. So there's a famous event. This did happen. So Thoreau refused to pay a tax. Now, at the time, it was still pretty common for this to take place. But at the time, Massachusetts had a tax that people would pay, and Boston was part of this. So people living in and around Boston paid this tax, a tax for the support of churches in the area or in the state more broadly. And Thoreau decided that was not in line with his understanding of American legal codes and the Constitution, and he said, he engaged in civil disobedience, and he refused to pay the tax. And so he was actually put in a cell, marched off to the local jail for a short time. And there's an apocryphal story. Apocryphal stories simply mean that they very likely did not happen. It's possible that Emerson, in fact, did bail out Thoreau and got him out of the jail cell for his little act of civil disobedience here. But the story is great, and I think it's illustrative of the point that I'm trying to make here, and that is this. So Emerson comes to the jail cell, and he's looking in there at Thoreau, his his mentee, right? His transcendentalist disciple of a kind. And he looks in at Thoreau, and he's kind of shaking his head in disgust because Thoreau has gotten himself thrown in prison and is, getting a lot of negative attention. And Emerson essentially says to Thoreau, Henry, what do you think you're doing? How could you have let this happen? What are you doing in there? And as the story goes, right, Thoreau looks back at Emerson and says, well, Ralph, what are you doing out there? In other words, you should be in here with me if you're serious about what we're promoting. If you're going to take the abstract philosophies and put them in play, that's the most important thing. You've got to not only think what's right and good, you have to put that into action. And a lot of people love this about Thoreau, and I think there really is something attractive about that. The ability to say, look, you've got to stick to your principles and be consistent with them. You can't just bark them out and then live hypocritically. And obviously there's a magnetism with that. Thoreau is most famous for a piece that he wrote called Walden. And this is another part of another reminder, I should say, of how Thoreau tries to take thought and put it into action. One of the things that Thoreau believed in was that people lived to, even in his own time, he thought that people lived in more complex ways than they really needed to, that they were in fact being undermined by the progression of modern society. He believed that people were far too dependent on the niceties in their lives that they happened to have available to them, and that that there was this over-reliance on material possession and wealth and prosperity through this burgeoning capitalist spirit that he had seen grow up around him in the United States at that time. And so Thoreau decides to do what he called he referenced this as an experiment in living. And so he goes and he with his own two hands, he gets the implements and he builds himself this little shack. And you can see I've got that here. They've got a replica of that on site now. And he went and lived here for about a year, a little less than a year. And just lived this life of ultimate simplicity on Walden Pond. And of course, he writes about the connection to nature, and having the bare necessities actually makes one more appreciative of what one has, and helps a person to stay focused on the things that really matter in life. So obviously, you can see it's a pretty bare bones place. He had a little table for writing and reading. He had another little desk on the side. You can see there. He had a bed, obviously, to sleep on, and he had a fireplace. And he cooked pretty bare bones food and made a living of it for a while. And then he went back. It's kind of funny because he's still a very 19th century upper middle class Bostonian in this way, because at the end of the day, he does go back to his pretty privileged life just outside of Boston and in his flat, and rejoined society pretty well. And yet that's the point he was trying to make was well taken, especially when Walden was published. There is merit in trying to simplify life and focus to really hone in on the things that truly matter. Devotion to principles, devotion to civic virtue, law and order. These are the kinds of things that Thoreau was interested in living out. So there's no doubt about it. Thoreau is one of the more interesting, engaging, even magnetic personalities. He was read in and around Massachusetts during his own lifetime, but in the decades that followed, and as we got into the 20th century, Thoreau's work after his death begins to get a much wider reading. And for a very long time, even up into the present day, Thoreau's work remains essential reading if you're talking about the American Transcendentalist movement. So really, really important guy for us. Okay, I want to move on and talk about a few others. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Shakers. Anne Lee Stanley, Mother Ann sometimes is the reference point. Anne Lee Stanley decides that she's had a vision from God to create this community. Now, I'm just going to warn you, both the Shakers and the Oneida community, we're dealing, and the Mormons, we're going to end talking a little bit about the Mormons here in just a bit. There are some very, very interesting experiments that are put into play here. I'll just put it that way for the moment. But the point here is that Americans, the Transcendentalists, I think are, I mean, obviously their belief system is very different than the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's pretty obvious. But there's a mainstream element to the Transcendentalists as well when it comes to societal function and virtue and all the rest. So I went with them first because there are still some very, very consistent traditional concepts of the social order that Transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau believed in. But these groups are definitely anything but traditional, and they're advocating for some pretty strange stuff. And so the communal societies that begin to spring up in America, really, they speak to this fact that the social fabric of the United States, by the time we get to the mid-century mark, the 1840s and 1850s, these communal societies do signal a move away from some of the more traditional Judeo-Christian orthodoxy and social constructs into some other areas, and also that there's a push, I think, to test the limits of what will be tolerated in a social setting in various parts of the Eastern Seaboard, primarily, where the Shakers ultimately end up in Ohio, but still most of this is taking place in the East. So they're interesting examples to us that, you might think that, communal living and, avant-garde thought like the Transcendentalists, that sounds like something that might be happening in the 1960s, right? And here we are, we're a full century or more before that, and we're already seeing some similar patterns. So I think it's interesting to at least note these groups because of their impact all the way back in the mid-19th century. So Mother Ann Lee, getting back to her. Anne Lee Stanley is her full name. She was typically referenced as Mother Ann by her, her cohorts who became part of the Shaker communities. So Ann Lee, Mother Ann, has this vision, as I said, a vision from God to formulate this community. And, they have, there's not a whole lot about them in the, in the Yawp text. I realize that there's just a small segment on them, so it doesn't dig into this a whole lot. Her vision was basically, again, to separate from the parts of the surrounding society, from the surrounding communities that she believed were, not allowing people to become who they were intended to be, that they were somehow undermining the human condition in some ways. And so she believes through this ostensible vision from God that she's been directed to go and form this community, which in and of itself may not seem like that big of a deal, but it's the customs that they put in place that certainly stand out as some of the more alarming realities of the Shaker culture. So Shaker customs include, the concept of, very, very different concepts regarding marriage and private property and politics and, even the use of alcohol and tobacco. So at the start, one of the things that the Shakers did was they believed, instead of private ownership of property, that these communities could live together in a much more, socialized neo-Marxist kind of an orientation, and that the sharing of the wealth of the resources of the community was essential, and it actually was better for people to live this way. They believed that, you know, it was more important for them to basically distance themselves from the society and the politics of the day, because those were indeed corrupting. The idea went. Two problematic things with the Shakers, and they were actually, a lot of Shaker members were inconsistent. There's a fair amount of hypocrisy on this. Mother Ann Lee, initially, I think there are indications that she herself may have had some issues with alcohol abuse at some point in her life. There's a lack of clarity on that. So she reverses course when she founds this community. When she sets this up, she tells the members that they must abstain from using alcohol and tobacco and whatnot. And yet we have, you know, there are documents from Shaker communities where they're clearly still, you know, drinking some alcohol and smoking tobacco and all the rest. So I don't know how seriously that was taken. It was at least one of the ideals that they claimed, but obviously a little bit problematic on that one. Marriage became a really interesting thing in Shaker communities. Marriage was, of course, allowed, so you had spouses that were living in these communities with others. But there, you know, as the communities began to form and there were traditions that were put in place, one of the weird things that Ann Lee Stanley herself actually advised was that even married couples living in these Shaker communities should not have sexual relations with one another. And so you obviously there are a lot of implications with that, especially in a marriage sense, but also through a procreation sense. So as you can imagine, with this very strange order being put into play, this means that you're not going to have subsequent young generations of little Shakers coming on down the pike, because, well, there's this direct order to abstain from sexual intercourse. And so I would say when we get to the 1850s and beyond even, this is one of the more problematic elements of the Shaker communities. You can imagine, so they go through, they want converts to Shakerism. Sometimes it's referenced as Shakerism. They want converts to the Shaker communities. And so they'll get some from the outside coming in occasionally, but of course, if you're not allowing for internal growth in the communities, your community is doomed in the long run. Well, of course, you're not going to be able to grow much internally if you're not producing children. So this becomes one of the strange realities of the Shaker communities. Now, what do we know the Shaker communities for? This is like the origin point for Shakers, and I realize I've listed some of the more, some of the odd associations with Shakers. Shaker communities do actually, they do have some growth issues in the 19th century. Ultimately, they do move beyond that surreal sexual restriction order, and a number of Shaker communities begin to grow. I mentioned the one that's in Ohio, that's just outside of Cleveland. Actually, there's a place now called Shaker Heights that was originally, a location where a Shaker community, a very large Shaker community, existed. The reason that the term, by the way, I should have told you this from the very beginning, but I just forgot, I guess. Shakers, the idea was that when they were in these moments of concentration and meditation, that they would actually kind of be awakened by the spirit of sorts, and they would shake. There's often a similar reference to the Quakers in Pennsylvania. I don't know. I think it very much seems to me like the Shakers stole that orientation a little bit. I've seen that reference point even in some of the journals. It's kind of strange. the Shaker communities were also well known. One of the things that allowed them to become a little bit independent or self-sufficient is probably the best way to put it, is they were able to sell wares and get a good amounts of money for them. They became very skilled artisans with woodworking in particular. A lot of really very just gorgeous pieces of, all sorts of implements, tables, beds, all sorts of things, chairs, obviously. So the carpentry skills and the the artisan artistic skills devoted to woodworking became very famous, and so Shakers were able to garner support and bring in money to help support their enterprises in that way. These communities have gone by the wayside for the most part. I don't believe there are any active Shaker communities here in the 21st century. So they went on into the did I just say the 20th century? In here in the 21st century, the Shaker communities, there were some that still existed in Ohio and east of Ohio into the 20th century. But post World War II, you didn't see Shaker communities really as in their traditional formation at that point. Okay. The Oneida community. So I'm going to start with what we probably know Oneida for. The Oneida communities, this is a communal society formed by this guy, John Humphrey Noyes. So we'll get to him in a minute. Oneida communities became very well known and associated with exquisite silverware. So they worked in silver, and I mean, it wasn't just silverware, like, for the table. They did, some really beautiful work with candelabras and some other silver implements, some pots and things along those lines, but also very famous for Oneida silverware. And you can still buy Oneida silverware here in the 21st century. So it's ultimately the legacy is with working in silver is probably the primary thing that we associate with the Oneida community. Noyes this guy is one of the more hypocritical leaders of these communal movements. And I say that for this reason. He commits himself, he reads Karl Marx and begins to try to find ways to implement his associations of Marxism in American society. And so, he's interested in creating a society where everyone in the community shares everything. And I do mean everything. I'll get to that in a minute. And his idea here is very similar, I suppose, to what we just talked about with the Shakers, that in these communal settings, that human beings are living lives directed beyond the self, beyond the individual, physical and mental personality, but they can engage in this realm of shared understanding and shared experience together. And that these communities can be very self-sufficient. So similar to the Shakers, the Oneida community is set up, and they struggle for a time to try to figure out how to make these communities function and to have the implements that they need to live their everyday lives, which is obviously not an easy thing to do. Noyes himself was from a very well-to-do family. So he's spouting all of these socialist theories, and he's trying to build this community. But he himself was born and raised in a very wealthy part. Most of his family is from New York, and very wealthy New York families. And so that's his background. And the other interesting thing is that even as he is trying to implement this community throughout his life, throughout his entire life, all the way through, he continued to he continued to use his family's very deep pockets to fund his own life and to live probably better than most of the others in the Oneida community were actually living. So he continued to live very well indeed, even as he's promoting the society of communalism. He was very intrigued by what he called the visionary, the groundbreaking vision of Anne Lee Stanley and the Shakers, and so he wants to He wants to borrow from that a little bit. He certainly does with the basic orientation of his community in this shared format. He has a couple, he calls himself, here's another hypocrisy that a lot of Christian scholars really beat him up for, and I think rightly so. He clearly understood that the society he was building would have, was viewed in its time as not just avant-garde, but strange, offensive, very much outside the boundaries of traditional society. And so he would frequently manipulate or misrepresent what he believed and what the community was about to those that he spoke to, so that he could kind of preserve the Oneida community from being consistently attacked. So he would tell people what he thought they wanted to hear an awful lot of the time. And so you'll read some of these interviews where he claims he claims to be a Christian, he claims to be a Protestant, he claims to be a Catholic on numerous occasions. And anyone who digs into his actual belief system realizes that nothing could be further from the truth. So he has some absolutely insane beliefs, and he's trying to get this community to live them out alongside him. One of those beliefs, by the way, is this that's very unorthodox and certainly does not exist within any boundary of Orthodox Christianity. His belief was, this unorthodox belief was in the notion of perfectionism, that people could achieve some sort of freedom from sin by living quote unquote perfect lives. And there were a lot of different measures that were put in place. So you need to understand something. This is not the freewheeling communalism of 1960s hippies that are in their communes tripping on acid and smoking marijuana or what have you. Now, this is a very different orientation. There were some very strict regulations and codes in some ways. There was a lot of, we'll talk about his notions of freedom in a second, and they were pretty wild. But you do also need to understand that under Noye's leadership, the Oneida community had some pretty strict expectations. You're not allowed to interact and talk about the community with anyone on the outside. If you did so, you would certainly be punished, perhaps even purged from the community. If you didn't agree with Noyes himself or some council members that lived in the community, if you didn't agree with their decisions, you better not say a whole lot about that. You better just keep it to yourself. The responses could be quite extreme. So his notions of perfectionism included abiding by the mandates set aside or put in place by the leadership of the Oneida community. And that involved sharing resources, sharing, food provisions. They weren't sharing clothing. Obviously, people need to wear their own clothes that fit them, but sharing food provisions, sharing other implements of life. Obviously people need to have houses to sleep in and beds and the necessities of life. There was, a sharing of those resources within the community. The other thing, the most disturbing part about this was Noyes and his concept of what he called complex marriage. So whereas the Shakers said, no sex, no sexual intercourse, John Humphrey Noyes, obviously, that was one aspect of Anne Lee Stanley's vision that he clearly did not agree with, because he decides that in this notion of complex marriage, that the monogamous relationship of traditional marriage was very constraining, was very limiting, and it deprived and undermined people from living lives that they were intended to, especially through this notion of sexual intimacy. And so he believed that the result, the solution, I should say, he believed the solution was to free everyone to engage in complex marriage and share one another sexually throughout the entire community. And so complex marriage becomes one of the calling cards of John Humphrey Noyes and the early years of the Oneida community. You can imagine I'm sure that there are many in the surrounding areas that became, pretty wary of Noyes and some of these elements. Certainly, probably tried to guard any loved ones, any family members that they cared about from joining the Oneida community for some of these reasons. It certainly put them under the microscope quite a bit, and there were some lawsuits leveled against the Oneida community, not surprisingly. Regardless of Noyes' intentions, they weren't able to just kind of glide through society and do what they wanted. They had pretty consistent challenges, in fact, from the territories. They were from the various territories that Oneida communities settled in. But this is yet another one of these communities. I already mentioned the silver, and they also dealt with. They did a lot of, for some reason, they made a lot of animal traps. Those became very, very common provisions that were sold by Oneida communities. So that helped them maintain some degree of separation and control and independence. The demise of complex marriage ultimately does happen by the time you get to the 1880s and 1890s. That whole notion with the Oneida communities has gone by the wayside, thankfully, probably because they were taking a beating from the regions in which they lived, and people did not want the Oneida communities existing if they were going to have such strange beliefs. Okay, now this one is not going to be nearly as surprising to you. I think that most evangelicals are pretty well aware of Mormonism and what Mormonism entails. It's definitely another sect that we need to talk about, because it's more so certainly than the Oneida community and the Shakers. Of course, we know that Mormonism has grown dramatically in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it is one of the more prominent religious cults in our country here in the 21st century. And we actually live near one of the sectors of our society where Mormonism has certainly been very prominent, maybe even dominant if we're talking about the state of Utah. So I guess my whole goal here with Mormonism is to just remind you of a few basic historical moments and tenets, and then we'll be pretty good to go. I think I should probably start by reminding those of you who may not be fully aware of this. It's quite possible, if you live near family who happens to be Mormon, or if you, sorry, I've got my mouse cursor is springing all over the screen. Sorry about that. So if you have interacted with Mormons consistently in your life, maybe you have family members who are Mormon. We've seen that quite a bit with Corbin students over the years. They themselves aren't Mormon, but they have cousins who are, for instance, things like that. You'll know this. So if you're one of those individuals and you've had interactions with Mormon, what I'm going to say is stuff that you've known for forever. But the reality is this: you don't have to listen to Mormons very long before you realize how manipulative they are regarding their own faith, because they try to sell themselves as Christians, right? And so even their commercials, right? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? So they make a profound effort to make it seem as if the Mormon faith is simply another denomination within Christianity itself. But there's nothing orthodox about Mormonism. And so this is a very manipulative cult that has always relied on that manipulation to bring people into the fold, and to make it seem very culturally acceptable by saying that Mormonism falls under the same theological and philosophical umbrella as traditional Orthodox Christianity. But of course, it's a cult that was formed in the 1830s by Joseph Smith, who claimed to have had a vision and claimed to have had interactions with an angel named Moroni, and had this vision to move. They started initially. They were in Illinois, in Nauvoo, Illinois, which Smith called the New Jerusalem. but there were a lot of controversial Mormon revelations that disturbed people in the surrounding communities near Nauvoo, and they essentially drove the Mormons out of Illinois. And the Mormons engaged on the infamous trek westward, ultimately settling west of the Rockies in modern day Utah. So Mormonism, just a couple of things, maybe reminders for you. If you read through the Book of Mormon, you really dig into the Mormon theology, you realize pretty quickly how outlandish the belief system is in some respects. And if you don't read through some of those passages, you do need to understand that the manipulative revelations regarding Christianity are just a big old mess. So if the idea that the Mormon belief that you die and that you inherit planets that you then populate, okay, that's just it's kind of the more outlandish part of their belief system. But you do need to understand that even with references to Christianity, the Mormons believe that Christ and Satan, that Christ and Lucifer were in fact brothers. Okay, this is a critical part of the Mormon hierarchy. That is, as soon as you say that, you understand the implications from that statement, that Christ, the Savior of the universe, part of the triune God, the claim that Christ can somehow be, directly related to Satan of all things. This is just a major problem. And so you go down through and you start, trying to make sure you understand what Mormonism actually says. It becomes clear very quickly, in fact, that Mormons do not believe in any of the same critical components of the faith. And it's just important for us to know that. So I suspect that these are elements you guys many of you in fact have been aware of for some time, but I just wanted to mention that. So you've got the establishment of this new religious cult, Mormonism, in the 1830s with Joseph Smith. One of the other famous early Mormons, of course, was Brigham Young. If you're at all familiar with Utah, of course, up in Provo, you have Brigham Young University in reference to Young himself. And the Young family, or the Young genealogy, is one of the more important in the Mormon faith, of course. And so any direct descendants of Brigham Young are kind of like Mormon royalty. And here you've got, probably the most famous example. Brigham Young's great-great-great-grandson is none other than Steve Young, the former San Francisco 49er and Hall of Fame quarterback. There are other, we've got, all sorts of famous Mormons in our society. Relatively recent presidential candidate back in 2012, Mitt Romney, of course, a very famous American politician. He is a Mormon. So, we even have some very prominent public figures in the United States who are in fact Mormon, which does at least indicate that Mormonism has this degree of acceptance in our culture and doesn't seem to be considered strange at this point in our history. Well, Christians should at least be aware of what Mormonism teaches, the essential and very, in fact, critical differences between Orthodox Christianity and Mormonism, which may claim Christianity, but it really is not. I think it's actually, in my estimation, that manipulation that the Mormons engage in when they reference Christianity is in some cases, is in some ways far more dangerous than something that is just blatantly critical of Christianity and makes that very clear. You don't have to wonder, what the nuances are for someone or for a philosophy that is clearly opposed to Christianity in every way. It's actually, I think, more destructive in many respects, that Mormonism tries to use the references to Christianity as something of a shield, as something of a tricky magnet to suck people in and make them believe that, in fact, the Mormon faith is just basically like Christianity. So, all right, guys. So that is it for us in this unit. You have the second exam on Friday. Again, please make sure that you log in right on time and get into that exam at 2 p.m. on Friday the 23rd. And you should have enough time in that hour to get through the exam. You'll have the same exact format of 15 multiple choice, a little like a 2-3 sentence paragraph on what, some things you thought were really important in the unit that we just went through. There will be 10 matching questions to answer, and that section is right this time. That's all. I double checked with the Populi IT folks, and we got that all squared away. So that section should function the way it was intended to function. And then you'll have 7 short answer essays, right? So remember those short answer essays. Remember to include context and examples that will solidify that short essay. Typically about a paragraph, a good contextual paragraph, not like 2-3 little mini sentences, but a good contextual paragraph is what you're looking for. Probably more like 5 sentences or so. And remember that you need to include the significance with each of those so that you're explaining to me the importance of what you're answering. Okay? All right, folks, I think that's it. And I'm glad we're through the unit. I'm sorry that this last one had to happen in the remote learning format, but I am hopeful anyway that we'll be back together on Monday. What would that be? Monday the 26th. So we'll hope. I don't know that will happen, but we'll at least cross our fingers and hope so. Okay. All right, folks, have a good rest of your day. We'll see you.